second, let's wander over to what the Holy Father has to say regarding Christian education of youth. Later on in the same book, the Pope talks about two of the most pernicious evils. This is found in the encyclical letter on Christian education of youth. He names them as being sex education and co-education. Now, in the encyclical letter, obviously, it talks about the purpose of Catholic schools, the reason why Catholic children should go to Catholic schools. And I know today, again, there are circumstances which make it for some impossible, but I'm trying to get across the point. You know, in most of the so-called Catholic schools today, the Vatican II school, they have sex education. This is condemned in the encyclical letter. The way that sex education used to be handled in school was through teaching about purity. And it is true that when someone gets into their teen years, the boys could be given talks by the priests, or the girls would be given talks by the nuns, to some degree. But again, indiscriminate sex education, boys and girls together, that's been condemned by the church. I remember when we lived in Coeur d'Alene, the very first school to introduce sex education was the local Catholic school. And it's been condemned. How can they justify that? The thing with co-education. We have, as we mentioned earlier, and you're all aware of, schools, one school for the boys and one school for the girls. And then again, in the minds of some people, when you meet some and talk about it, say, gee, you got two schools, why don't you put them together? It's condemned right here in the encyclical letter, written by the Holy Father. Why is that? You know how some people portray the Catholic Church? I remember when we were giving marriage instructions, in the book we were using for reference, Plain Talks on Marriage, right at the beginning of the book, the question is asked, how is it possible for priests who aren't married to give marriage instructions? And it goes on to, the author of this book is a little facetious, and he imagines people wondering how these 85-year-old cardinals or bishops, who most certainly must hate women for the marriage vocation, will give marriage instructions. Again, how in the minds of people they can get things so twisted. First of all, we know that our divine Lord gave to the apostles the authority to go forth and to teach. One of the best ways to find out about marriage on the part of a priest is to talk to married people. And I think a priest, when he's been counseling for some time, knows more about the problems of marriage than even those that are married, because he hears about everyone's problems. But again, to get across the point, the church has been given by God the authority to teach. And the reason that co-education was condemned is not because the church has this archaic outlook on sex. It's because the church recognizes the fact that as human beings we were born with a stain of original sin. Now it is true that when it comes to little children, insofar as a sex attraction, it is not there. And unfortunately at times, exceptions have to be made. But if these exceptions became the rule, whether there's a sex attraction or not, little boys and girls together are taught that it's normal to be together. And it is not the mind of Holy Mother the Church in this regard. Boys should be raised as boys, and girls should be raised as girls. In our age today, some people think it should be different. And unfortunately, in many cases it is, where you have the effeminate men and the masculine women in this goofed up society that we live in. But again, co-education is what the Holy Father said in the encyclical letter. False and harmful to Christian education is a so-called method of co-education. This, too, by many of its supporters, is founded upon naturalism and the denial of original sin for those who promote co-education. But by all upon a deplorable confusion of ideas that mistakes a leveling promiscuity and equality for the legitimate association of the sexes. The Creator has ordained and disposed perfect union of the sexes only in matrimony, and with varying degrees of contract, and in family and in society. Besides, there is not in nature itself, which fashions the two quite different in organism, in temperament and abilities, anything to suggest that there can be or ought to be promiscuity and much less equality in the training of the two sexes. So again, when the brothers, or in some cases when the sisters work with boys, there's a difference in working with boys. We had to, out of necessity this year, have some of the sisters, because we don't have enough brothers to do it. We had some of the sisters teach some of the younger boys. And after one day in working with boys, they're used to working with girls, they said, I can't believe it. There is absolutely no difference. There's nothing alike between the boys and girls. They're totally different. And the sisters, some of them were confused because they weren't used to the boys acting like they were. They were used to the reaction of girls. And they had to get a little tougher with the boys to keep them in line. Whereas they did the same thing with the girls, they'd start crying. So again, there's a total difference. And Holy Mother of the Church, recognizing this in her wisdom, condemned coeducation. So again, that's just the coeducation part in the encyclical letter. The Holy Father goes on talking about original sin. Original sin, though it was canceled in your soul by that purifying and sanctifying grace, which has thereby reconciled you to God and made you adopted sons and heirs to heaven. Original sin has left in you the sad inheritance of Adam. This is an interior derangement that conflict within ourselves, which St. Paul has so well described. This great apostle thought, even while in the depths of his heart there was delight in the law of God, that there was another law existing in his members, a law of sin, a law of passions and disordered inclinations, never fully subdued, but going hand in hand with the flesh and the world. With such things as these, Satan strives to put souls on trial. This is the war between the spirit and the flesh. And again, this is something that is basic. So again, wouldn't it be unfair we talk about coeducation? I heard people say, oh, but the brothers would be there, the sisters would be there. You know, what would be wrong with that? Yeah, the brothers and sisters would be there, that's right. But what's going on in their heads when they're placed in the occasion of sin? Do not let yourselves be deceived into thinking that your souls are indifferent to temptation and invincible amid decoys and dangers. It is true that habit often succeeds in making the spirit less subject to such impressions. But to imagine that all souls can be made insensible to incitements would be to argue in favor of the belief that these wicked impulses will come to an end or will lessen their evil complicity with our disordered and decadent nature. Even the saints, as a matter, I say especially the saints, were aware of the weakness of fallen human nature, especially the saints. And even when they had grown in virtue to such a degree that they seemed to be without fault, they did not presume to put themselves in an occasion of sin and think that they were invincible. They knew enough to realize that if they placed themselves in an occasion of sin without any good reason, they also could fall. And when someone has reached heights in the spiritual life and falls, they usually fall harder than someone who's not striving for virtue. The Holy Father goes on and again making reference to the age in which he lived, and again it's worse now, but I like to quote what he said regarding a materialistic age and the age of sin. Avoiding any unreasonable pessimism, we nevertheless cannot fail to point to the rising tide of both public and private wrongdoing that threatens to engulf souls in its muddy waters and to flood the whole order of common welfare. Just as every period of history puts some characteristic imprint as a seal on its actions, so our own age is displaying its defects in such symbols as past centuries have not seen, except perhaps in association with the same meanings. With the eye and with the mind's eye, measure the sins of the world, their great number, seriousness, and frequency. Some sins are so unheard of and so uncommon that they need new words to designate them. This is in the time of Pope Pius XII. Again, can you imagine people listening to these words and not doing anything about it? Again, you could see the handwriting on the wall. Here was a Holy Father just crying out, saying in effect to the people, wake up, can't you see what's going on? He realized what would happen beyond his day if his word were not listened to. Always louder and more piercing, declares the Pope, are the cries for help resounding from far and near, for help in the wretched conditions of family life and of the younger generation. There seems to be unanimous opinion that the morality of a very great number of youth is continually on the decline. We could not name a better objective than the salvation of family and youth, for which the church might aim all her efforts. Again, a plea on the part of the Pope. We as individuals, as members of families, individual families, have to do everything within our power to strengthen the family. Again, this is an all-out war between the forces of Christ and the forces of Antichrist. It is even more disturbing, the pontiff goes on, to see that artfulness with which the contagion is spread so openly and systematically by means of immoral shows, films, novels, and magazines. The people, especially the young and adolescent, are infected with vice and likewise with irreligion as though with disease. If it be objected that such evil has existed in every era, that the complaint is nothing new, this may be granted. But also in the past, at the cost of great effort, there has been at least some degree of success in restraining the evil or restricting its course. Today, that same current may rush like a flood through a break in a dike, ruining cities, devastating hillsides, and submerging entire populations in a filthy tide. Now again, we live in an age where anything goes. And the big cry is, I have my rights. If I want to stand on TV, be on TV, and take God's name in vain, and use every four-letter word in the book, I have my rights. This is the age in which we live. And someone tries to prevent evil from taking place, he or she's in court, being sued by someone, because her rights or his rights were infringed upon. And again, if Pope Pius XII used these unbelievable words in describing the age in which he lives, I repeat, what would he do if he were alive today? We shall not now, says the pontiff, discourse upon the latent hereditary characters transmitted to offspring, or the considerable influence these will have on the future development. Sometimes these hereditary traits point an accusing finger at the disorders in the life of the parents, who have such grave responsibility to give their children a truly Christian education, even at the cost of great sacrifice. O fathers and mothers, whose reciprocal love the faith of Christ has sanctified, prepare yourselves well before the time for the birth of your children. Prepare the atmosphere of the home with a purity in which their eyes and minds will open to light and life, an atmosphere that will surround with the sweetness of Christ every step of their moral development. Again, the importance of you, yourselves, as parents, having the faith, knowing the faith, so that you can pass it on to your children. We've heard quite often on mission, people come out with something like this. Say you meet someone for the first time and you're trying to explain what's taking place. And some will come back and say, well, supposing what you say is true. I mean, where am I going to take my children to church? I have to take them somewhere. You say, but that's not Mass. Well, I know. Some of that you said, well, I know it's not, but I have to take them somewhere. Isn't that a tragedy? On one hand, saying they know that's not Mass, you like say, well, I know that's not right. I know by going to that school they're not being taught the truth, but they have to go somewhere. Again, that's not even logical. Be just as logical as saying, well, if he doesn't deny Christ, he's going to be put to death. I know he shouldn't deny Christ, but I mean, you expect him to die? Thank God the martyrs or the apostles did not have that attitude. Again, we have to make some very tough decisions today. And in making these tough decisions, at times we would be very unpopular. And again, looked upon as being fanatics, not being prudent. While I agree there is prudence, I repeat, we cannot use prudence to such a degree that we wind up compromising our faith. The Holy Father goes on, pointing out again the authority that parents have been given by God to influence upon their children. Defective use of their authority was pointed out by the angelic pastor as one elementary failing of many parents, a reason for the fruitlessness of the ethical instruction given to their sons and daughters. In particular, By conforming too often to customs, they surrender the authority which they ought rather to exert, within due limits, but effectually, whether to impose true standards or to oppose false ones. They are wrong when they give way to immodest fashions. Some are further to be blamed for their thoughtlessness in encouraging, if not actually demanding, such seriously improper attitudes. You know, when some people, again, we're talking in general terminology, but when some people talk about the fact that they'll admit on one hand, Our Lady of Fatima warned about immodest styles and fashions. She said, styles and fashions will be introduced that gravely offend my divine son. And then there are others, you know, again, using prudence, will justify just about anything. What in the world is immodesty? That's what I say to those people. If what you're allowing or saying is okay, what do you have to do to be immodest? Be completely nude and then that would be immodesty? Again, Our Lady lamented this in 1917. Styles and fashions will be introduced that will gravely offend my divine son. Find the literature that was written by priests in the 30s, in the 40s, in the 50s. Read the literature over carefully. Get out some old pictures and see what clothes were worn by people in those days, insofar as tight form-fitting, the length of skirts, sleeveless dresses, etc., etc. And develop again a Catholic sense. It gets to the point again that you can justify just about anything, can't you? In this area of immodesty, one of the difficulties is at times something may not be per se a sin. You ever have this? You ever think about this? You have 20 different things that may be done in a series, and if you take each one by itself, you can't really say per se, infallibly, this is a sin. But these 20 things happen, one after the other, and bang, you have a mess on the other side. So again, there will those that will argue and justify, well, since none of these 20 different things per se are sin, it's all right to do it. And they can justify just about anything. You get into the area about pants being worn by women, or shorts, and various forms of clothes, culottes. I remember some woman asked me, she says, well, what's wrong with culottes? I said, you know what culotte means? In French, it means pants, culotte. What it means. It's another term for pants. And you say, well, if I get big, wide, baggy pants, isn't that better off than wearing a short skirt? Well, sure it is. But when you consider the whole movement behind it, see the whole picture. What better way to make women act like men is to have them dress like men. Even though it may not be, per se, in all situations, a sin, it could be. Tight pants would be a sin. So then you have this big argument. Well, you're being fanatical. You're telling women not to do this and not to do that. Again, should we just sit back and say, sometimes we feel like saying it, do what you want to do. Go ahead. And then if you lose your soul, or you have problems with your kids, don't come running to us. We don't say that. But again, humanly speaking, you get tempted to at least say it when you always run into this brick wall. What would be more pleasing to Almighty God? That's what we should ask ourselves. What would be best for my children? We would say to the women, and we say to our girls and our women, learn to be ladies. Get some Catholic class. Really learn to be ladies. Learn about the dignity of womanhood. Be feminine. Don't allow yourself in any way to even come close to being an occasion of sin. Use your influence for good. And we would say to the men, love your wives, love your daughters and your sons. Teach your wives and your daughters. Encourage them. When they have difficulty in this regard, encourage them. Tell them that you love them just the way they are, as ladies and as women. And treat them accordingly. As you heard read the other day, beautiful reading by Archbishop Goodyear on womanhood. What has been done to womanhood in our day and age today is probably unparalleled because of the means being used with the TV and the newspapers, the media. So again, all of this must be imparted, as we said earlier, to your own children. Pope Pius XII goes on, O Christian mothers, if you did but know what a future inner torment you are inviting for your sons and daughters by your imprudence in rearing them accustomed to go about partially clothed, making them lose the simple sense of modesty, you would blush. Further, you would fear risking ignominy to yourselves and injury to the children heaven has entrusted to you for their nurture as Christians. And again, you can have someone turn back and say, gee whiz, she's only 3 or 4 years old. What are you, a nut? You're a fanatic or something? You think there's something wrong with a 3 or 4-year-old? You're trying to instruct the children. They learn when they're 1 year old, 2 years old. Are you going to allow them, you're going to teach them something or allow them to do something, which is not an occasion of sin, obviously, but you're going to allow them to do something where they become accustomed to it, and then at some point in time say, you shouldn't have done that, now you're going to do this. If they don't know anything other than that which is right and good, you won't have any problems. But if you introduce into the lives of your children a double standard, you're going to have difficulty. You don't think children soak in things at 3, 4 years old? You know, they've taken tests. A child can learn how to typewrite at 3 and 4 years old, can learn foreign languages at 3 and 4 years old. Their capacity for soaking in is unbelievable at that age. And they see what goes on. Some of the whirling kids are 2 and 3 years old are singing TV commercials as they sit before that boob tube day in and day out. So they're soaking in the bad stuff. What you have to do is see to it that they soak in that which is good and that which is holy. And when we say to mothers, the Pope continues, we repeat to others, especially those women of faith and also of piety, who by example, by their willingness to follow this or that daring mode, are destroying the last hesitation that has held back their sisters from adopting fashions which may become an occasion for spiritual ruin. As long as certain flaunting styles in dress remain the sad prerogative of women of questionable repute, almost a trademark for recognizing them as such, just so long a respectable woman will not venture to copy them for herself. But on the day that these things are worn by persons quite above suspicion, then there can be no doubt about the trend that will follow, which like a torrent will rush headlong and sweep over the most dangerous falls. Years ago, you could recognize by the way that they dressed the women of ill repute. They advertised themselves. They wanted people to know who they were and what they were about. And the Pope is saying when these same things are worn by people, good people who really mean it when they say they love God, but they've been sucked in again to this type of a situation where they're wearing things that are an occasion of sin and they don't recognize it. We have a book, and we're not getting into it now, but it's an older book that Father Clement had called Love, Sex, and the Teenagers. It was written by Father Lord, who wrote extensively on the Blessed Mother, and the book was dated 1947. Another one of the many books we'd like to get reprinted and have the parents read it first. Love, Sex, and the Teenagers. He gets right down to the nitty-gritty, and he's explaining very carefully the do's and the don'ts. Again, I don't have any doubt in my mind that if we begin, and we're going to, but as we begin to talk about those things in that book, we're going to hear, oh, come on, fanatic, and other terminology. Again, these books were accepted by Catholics in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. But again, in our so-called enlightened age, where I repeat for probably the 12th or 13th time, while there is prudence, I repeat, we're at the point where we have to start living the faith, preaching the faith, and acting accordingly without being imprudent, but without compromise. And again, the problem is not continually talking about our faith. We've talked about it and talked about it and talked about it for years. Thank God we have. Our problems do not stem from not knowing at least the basics of our faith. Our problems stem, if we have any, from allowing the influence of the world to cause us to not be what we should be in the area of Catholic social principles. Again, we use as an example to get across a point. When Noah built the ark, he could have cared less what everyone else on the face of the earth thought about him. He was given by God a command to do it, and he was doing it. It took him 100 years to do it. The local nut for 100 years building this ark in the middle of nowhere. And everyone else in the world knew better. But he was on the ark and everyone else was destroyed. You have the example of Lot and his wife and their 2 daughters in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. They certainly must have remained in the home for quite a deal of time. They were the only ones that were found just. Everyone else was destroyed by God. Again, do we have to come to the conclusion, if we live in an age that is the worst age ever, that's what Pope Pius XII said. I don't think he was a fanatic. Pope St. Pius X said it. I don't think he was a fanatic. And it's worse now. So if we live in the worst age probably ever in the history of mankind, are we supposed to become lax? Are we supposed to take the words of Pope Pius XII and say, well, that doesn't apply now? It's worse now than it was then. And again, by saying that, that doesn't mean that we become pessimistic. We're not pessimistic. Thank God for our Blessed Mother that we can have an attitude of hope in spite of all of what's going on around us. With the help of Our Lady and her Divine Son, we can not only persevere, we can become saints. In this age of loss of faith, we can have a tremendous faith and a tremendous love for our Holy Catholic faith. And even live in the world, but not be of the world, in spite of the evil that surrounds us. But again, it calls for an all-out effort. It's not just enough to know the bare minimums of our Catholic faith. Again, we should be doing everything possible to see to it that we're not even close to an occasion of sin. Not just trying to barely get by in all areas. Not to in any way risk the loss of our immortal soul. The Holy Father goes on talking about the family. In the family, the Supreme Pontiff asks fathers, are you not the head? Must not your word, your deed, your power, your direction be always to the fore in influencing this generation of men? They who now sit smiling upon your knee thrive on your bread and also on your teaching. Under your watchful paternal care, those in adolescence today will tomorrow be on the way to maturity. So the Father will form in the Son the sort of Christian he himself is. And the Son in his turn will treasure up and increase the wisdom and words, the deeds and traditions handed down by his Father. Have you ever had the experience, and again, I'm sure you all have, when you were a little child especially, and your father told you something, and you're with your friend, your little friend, and you're arguing, going back and forth, saying, no, that's not true. How do you know? My father told me. He's infallible to a little child, right? So everything the father said sinks right in. And I repeat, if the father uses his influence right at the very beginning, son, you can't do this. This is not pleasing to God. You teach the children that sin is displeasing to Almighty God. The worst thing they could do is sin. The worst thing they could do is to hurt Jesus. I remember again another example in a family where this very thing was being done, was being taught. And how this little girl did something wrong and she was scolded by her father, and I was there and saw what took place. And in this particular place, there was a chapel attached to the house. And the father says, I want you to go in the chapel, and I want you to tell Jesus you're sorry. The little girl was about 3 years old. And she went up into the chapel, right in the front, by the communion room. She said, dear Jesus, I'm sorry. And she's talking like this. I wanted to listen to what she was going to say. Bawling because she hurt Jesus. Now again, if someone was raised like this continually, she wasn't a warped child. Normal child, she liked to go out and play. She had friends. But again, the parents were very careful who her friends were. And she was taught that the most important thing was, don't commit sin. Don't hurt Jesus. And again, the father, if the father is what he should be, especially with the boys, how tremendous that's going to be. How this is going to be passed on through the children. If the mother is the heart of the family, he affirms on another occasion, the father is the head. So primarily on the father's valor, his wide manliness and diligence, there depends the sane and wholesome success of family life. Another quote, perhaps some mother will say, modern children are so hard to control. With this son or daughter of mine, there's nothing to be done. Nothing is of any use. It is true that at that age, of 12 or 15, many do seem intractable. But why? Because from the time they were 2 or 3 years old, everything has been given or allowed. Everything they had has been handed to them. Give careful attention that as your children grow up, you wield over them an authority that is benevolent and serene, strong and frank, not surrendering to every scene of tears and caprice. From the very dawn of their rational life, make them trustfully conscious of the touch of hands that delicately caress but still control and guide with untiring prudence. To combine graciousness with authority is to win, to triumph in that contest which becomes your duty as parents. And again, children at a very, very early age, they know exactly how to get what they want. It's like shedding a few tears. As soon as they get what they want, the tears dry up and they're satisfied. And again, that's why the parents have to be in control. They are the ones who are given that authority by God. And Pope Pius XII warns them not to squander that authority. He says one consideration is the strict right to tenure of authority, the right to give orders. Another is that moral preeminence with which effective authority is formed and adorned, made active and efficient, successful both in its influence over others and in obtaining true obedience. The first is the right conferred upon you by God, with the very act that makes you father and mother. The second is a prerogative that may well be acquired and conserved. Always be on your guard against anything that might lessen your authority. Beware of squandering that authority. So again, in our society, unfortunately, the state says, in effect, you don't have the right to teach your children what you want to if it interferes with the mind of the state. And that right, again, is a God-given right. And it's strange, when you think about a communist country, in the communist country, the rights are taken away from the people, right? And they're given to the state. Now, we don't live in a communist country, but we see what's happening. The rights of the parents are being taken away, to some degree, and given to the state. Again, the local social worker is like the local God. I repeat, kids run away, they don't like it, they go to the social worker, and that's it. We had a situation some time ago, 4 or 5 years ago, where a woman in California that we did not know had a problem with 2 of her sons. They were probably 13, 14 years old. They'd been in and out of the reform school, and somehow she met someone that we didn't know, and they asked her to send her kids up to our school. Well, we don't run a reform school there, but anyway, these 2 kids came up there, and they're actually given the choice. They were going to be locked up again in the reform school, and this woman pleaded with the judge, can I at least try this to send them to a boarding school, etc., etc. They lasted 1 day. They were in school 1 day, and they ran. So we found out they were down at the police station. I went there and I talked to the policeman who was involved in working with young people. And I could see the kids behind the screen. And I said, I'd like to talk to them. He said, they don't want to talk to you. I said, well, can I talk to them? He said, no. I said, well, were the parents notified? And he said, yes, they were. And I said, what's going to happen? He said, they're going to be put in a foster home. I said, you mean the mother wants him in a foster home? He said, no, the mother wants him in school, but they don't want to go. And the mother got all kinds of lip from the one who called her up. She's, I'm the mother. And the guy said, listen, lady, this is what this man told me. He said, listen, lady, watch your language. Be careful. And here's her 2 sons, thousands of miles away from home. She wants them to go to a Catholic school. They don't want to go, and they're put in a foster home. Unbelievable. And really, what can we do about it? All we can do at this point is pray if there's any legislation to change that. We can try to change it. But it seems like it's gone to the point in this regard of no return. All we can do is concentrate on seeing to it that the children are raised up in such a way that they won't do that. That if they're raised up properly, chances are they won't do that. On the other hand, if they're not raised properly, and they find out about it, gee, what an easy way out. Mom and Dad don't want me to do such and such. All I got to do is go downtown and turn myself in. I can go live with someone who lets me watch TV all the time. Lets me do just about anything I want to do. And unfortunately, that's true. Unfortunately. Again, there's much more that could be gone into it. I would suggest if it's not really that available, I think there's probably half a dozen copies. We'll try to get this thing reprinted too. But it's a beautiful book. Again, the title can be misleading, The Problem of Teenage Purity. But for the most part, again, as you've heard us read to you, it's exhortations from the Pope. Yes, dealing in areas of purity and morality, but especially talking about the family and the education of youth and what is necessary in order for the church to survive. Again, we know, using general terminology, the church is going to survive. We have Christ's promise. But if we want to be part of that church, then a lot depends on what you do with your children. If you raise them properly, teach them well, teach them to put God first, the church will be here and will remain here in your respective areas. On the other hand, if we become lax and refuse to teach them properly, if we're too busy to take the time, then obviously we and they are going to have problems. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, amen.